Hello and welcome back to another episode of Litcast, the revision podcast for WJEC GCSE. Today we are going to complete our Unit 1 exam mini-series by talking about the big question at the back of the paper, the unseen poetry. It's the one lots of people are pretty scared about, but actually it can be a fantastic grade booster, and there's just a few tips we can go through that might help you build some confidence when approaching this unseen question. So, with that being said, let's get into it. All right, the unseen poetry. It's a bit of a Marmite question. People either love it or they hate it, but it can be a really simple grade booster for anyone who, really has a go at approaching the poems and just giving it a go. Okay, so we recommend that you spend about an hour on this section. So in the context of the exam, you've done your extract, you've done your essay, you're feeling great about Mice and Men, and your brain is warmed up looking at those questions and exploring that literature. So you're coming into this question in a good way, in a good headspace. And you'll be given your two poems and you'll be asked to talk about both of them and the effect that they have on you, and talking about similarities and differences. So, the best way to practice for this question is simply to practice past paper questions. And I know that seems frustrating because it's not kind of the magic cure that everyone sort of hopes for, but it's true. The best way to practice to doing this is to just expose yourself to as many poems as possible. So on the WJEC website, you can access loads of past papers. It doesn't matter if you practice on foundation or higher tier, to be quite honest, because you're, again, just trying to get used to this. Quite often the poems are the same, or one of the poems is the same on both papers in the same sort of series. But you'll have two poems and you'll be asked to talk about them and compare them. So it does make sense to just go on there and to practice and to practice and to practice. In addition, we want to use the paper to our advantage. So in the section B, it will tell you what both poems are about. It tells you that. It gives you that answer. And so many people don't read this line because they turn to the poetry and they panic. It's really important that you read it. It's the first bold line on the page. So when you look at the section B paper, it will say, spend about 1 hour, think carefully about the poems before you write, etc. And then it will say, both poets talk about, describe, whatever. It will tell you what both of those poems are about. And then it will say, write about both poems and their effect on you, show how they're similar and show how they're different. And then just some stuff about it doesn't really matter how you lay out your answer, as long as you talk about both poems. Make sure you read that line, underline it, highlight it, circle it, do all three. Just make sure that that's there, because that gives you an angle to read the poem from. And the reason why I say this is because the same poem could appear for 3 years in a row. It hasn't, but the same poem could appear for 3 years in a row, but have a different focus each time, because there's many ways to read a poem. So making sure that you have the right focus in mind will help you make comparisons and will also help you interpret the poem. Now, lots of you will have already completed your poetry coursework or your poetry non-examination assessment. If you haven't, then that's fine. You'll be doing it later on in the course. But if you have completed your poetry NEA, then you know how this comparison works. You know how to structure it. You can choose whether to jump from one poem to the other, back and forth, and compare and contrast, or whether to write about one poem first and then write about the second poem, referring back to the first. Either is fine. There is no preferred structure for the essay as long as you are completing what's expected in terms of writing about both poems and comparing them. What is important, though, is What's important to remember, though, is that when you did your poetry, if you've done it, you did that through sessions in class. You were taught those poems. You had guidance. So the standard expected there is very different to the standard expected here. Now, that doesn't mean you can just write nothing and expect some marks. But what that does mean is that the examiners understand that you are going into this exam in a stressful environment. You're under time pressure. And then you're expected to sit down and read poems that you've never read before and comment on them. And you're expected to compare them and talk about them in a sophisticated way. Therefore, the marking and the recognition of those things is generous. And what I mean by that is they understand that this is difficult and they're going to give you credit for it. So, the most important thing we need to do here is keep a cool head. We need to read the poems. We need to write about them. Because that way you're going to get marks. What you don't want to do is turn to this and go, oh, you know what? I did great on my cement. I've had enough. I'm not going to do it. Because if you do that, you're not going to get any marks. No words, no marks. That kind of makes sense, right? So let's talk about some top tips that we can think about. So the first thing we want to do is give ourselves time to read, annotate and plan. We have an hour to complete this section. Even if you spent a little bit of extra time on Of Mice and Men, let's say you've got 45 minutes on this section, you can still give yourself 10 minutes to read, annotate and plan. That will make your writing, that will make your essay, that will make everything infinitely better. You want to go through, think about what that first line said, both poets talk about, both poets discuss. And you want to underline any words or images that you could write about. And you also, to read the poem just as you would normally, then have a go at reading it again from punctuation mark to punctuation mark. Punctuation is such an underrated, in terms of kind of GCSE analysis, or GCSE responses. People just don't talk about punctuation. Talk about punctuation in poetry. It's a really easy way to get structure into your writing. So think about punctuation mark to punctuation mark. Is the punctuation significant? Does that change the way the poem reads? Does that change the meaning of the poem in any way? Always kind of think about then the title of the poem. That can help you contextualize it. And it's always worth writing about the title as well and comparing the title. Because sometimes the title has an obvious meaning, in which case it's an easy win, it warms your brain up, write about it. But sometimes it can be quite abstract, and it takes a couple of readings of the poem to kind of work out why the poem is called what it's called. So titles can often be quite a good way into the poem. Now, don't worry if you don't understand every word in a poem. Most people won't, especially in this environment, understand every word of a poem, because you're in a stressful examination environment, you're under kind of time restraint. So it would be quite difficult for you, unless you've encountered the poem before, to be able to pick out every single thing ever said about it. What we want to think about is things like the general mood, or it might be kind of thinking about who the speaker is, what situation is being portrayed here, what moment is being portrayed. And give yourself grace if you don't know every single word. Sometimes you'll be able to work it out from kind of what's being said. And by word, I don't mean you literally don't know what a word means. I mean, in the context of the poem, you might not be able to work out the significance of a word. So again, give yourself grace, read the poem, think about the general mood, the themes, the tones. Try and make sure you get to the end of a poem, because often there might be a twist, or there might be kind of a key image. Exactly like we talked about with the extract, where the beginning and the end is really important. Same with the poem. Have a look through it. The beginning and the end is probably going to have something significant you can talk about. Ask yourself about the speaker as well. Really think about the speaker. Who is talking in this poem? Who are they talking to? Are they talking to anyone? Are they simply describing a scene? Is this directed to someone? What's the situation? What's the relationship? If that is the case, is there anything then structurally or linguistically, so the words or the punctuation or the stanzas, that underpins that mood or underpins what that speaker's trying to convey? Work out the mood and the atmosphere by looking at key words. So think about when you're reading it, again, any words you can group together. You might have heard of them being referred to as lexical sets or semantic fields, but groups of words that kind of belong in the same sort of category. So for example, you might have a religious lexical set: saint, prayer, holy, those sorts of things. Or you may have a celestial lexical set, so sun, moon, stars. You may have a lexical set or a semantic field of school, so desk, pencil, corridor, teacher, board, chalk, all those kinds of things. So have a look and see if there's any words you can group together, how they group together, and what does that again say or feed into the image or the message. What does the poet want the reader to take away? This is important as well. So in terms of reading the poem, what are they trying to tell us? Why have they written the poem, and how does it affect us as a reader now we've read it? Again, that might be really obvious, it might be really abstract, and it might be really difficult to work out. That's fine. Again, it's just about you having the opportunity to think about both of these poems, and it may be a case that one's really obvious, one's really abstract. You can talk about that, you can write about that, and your personal response is valid here. So the assessment objectives are split into AO1, AO2 and AO3 this time, so we've got our comparison in there. And we want, therefore, to be showing our similarities and our differences. So here we want to be thinking about our vocabulary. So the poems both have obvious similarities in both, and a link between both poets choose to. You can always talk about the absence of something as well. In neither poem is there any, or neither poem chooses to, or neither poet chooses to. And then for differences, things like whereas, however, on the other hand, in contrast, etc. Okay. And really, the most important thing to remember about this is that there is no right or wrong answer. Poetry is kind of the wordy form of art, where words are used to create images, to create moods, to create an impact, an effect on the person consuming it, the reader. And that will affect them in different ways. That's why poetry is so beautiful and so timeless, because we read it and we receive it in different ways depending on who we are in our life experiences. So as long as you have an opinion that you can share, be confident with it and support it with reference to the poem. Now, the only time where your kind of response might be classed as wrong is if you have misread something. So if you have actually misread what a word means or something like that, that's where your interpretation may be considered kind of wrong. Or if you've made a connection in error, where there's sort of no connection to something, but you have kind of assumed that there's a connection there. But most of the time, your opinion will be right, and your impression will be right because you've read the poem and you have a response to it. Now, a good way to demonstrate to the examiner that you're kind of aware that poetry is like art and therefore there's multiple interpretations is to make sure that you're using that tentative language. So using might, may, could, perhaps this word could suggest, this image might imply, the poet might have wanted us to think of this. So thinking about that tentative language, where we're not saying that something does mean something, we're saying that it could mean this. And that's a good way of making sure that you're showing the examiner, look, I know that there's other ways to read this. This is my way of reading it. And what a nice way to kind of finish your response. You can conclude it with a strong argument, but if you wanted to, you can also just share your personal response to the poem. That's what it's asked you to talk about, so you're more than welcome to do that. So what effect did the poem have on you? How did it make you feel? Do you identify with anything in the poem? Now, if you hated the poem, and if you really didn't find any connection to it, it's probably better you don't write anything, I'll be honest. But if there is something that you can say that's some sort of personal response, great, write it down. If you felt that one poem spoke to you more than the other, then again, write that down. If you absolutely hate poetry and you never want to see another poem again, and that would be sad because poetry is fantastic. But if you do genuinely feel like that, then I would suggest perhaps not writing that down in the essay and just thinking about it instead. So, just a couple of final top tips thinking about the process of analysis for the poetry. So think about the obvious surface meaning first. Don't try and jump ahead and think about what metaphorical literary meanings there are. Think about the surface meaning first. Then try to get into some of the deeper meanings. So think about, could you sum up what that poem's about in a sentence? Think about the situation, the speaker, whether the speaker's talking to someone, whether they're describing something, and think about the connections that perhaps you can make at a surface level between the poems, because that will quite often give you a gateway to some of the deeper meanings as well. Try to pick out some quotes and talk in detail about things. Some the semantic fields can really help, or the lexical set. So try and kind of pick out some keywords that you can talk about, and use those specific words to compare to. So try and do broad and specific comparisons between the poems. That's always a good way of demonstrating your knowledge and sophistication as well. And lastly, and I know this is probably quite difficult with this question because it is asking a lot of you, and everyone is aware of that. The examiner knows that, your teachers know that, everyone knows that this question asks a lot of you, and the mark scheme does reflect that. So the last tip is simply to just have a bit of fun with it, because it's an unseen poem. You've never seen it before. You'll probably never see it again. And it's asking you to tell us what you think about it and what you like about it and what impact it's had on you once you've read it. So use this as an opportunity to share those thoughts and feelings, and to demonstrate your skills in situ in the exam, and enjoy it, because everything that you're writing down is a bonus at this point. And the more that you share, the more that you write, the more that you kind of try and explore these poems, the more chance you have of getting some good marks for this question. So keep practicing those poems, keep pulling up. It doesn't even have to be poems that are on past papers. Just find 2 random poems and try and compare them. The past papers are always a bit more curated, so I would recommend those first. But if you fancy a challenge, make up your own pairs and see how that works. But poetry doesn't need to be scary. Poetry can be a fun exploration, and poetry can be also a deeply personal experience. And this is trying to encourage you to explore that, albeit in quite a false examination environment. But it's trying its best to do that. So enjoy it. So that concludes our Poetry Top Tips episode and the end of our little mini-series for exam preparation for Unit 1. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with some more episodes soon. Remember, you can find our link to our Litcast Live, which is happening over the Christmas break, in the show notes. So if you want a little bit of an extra revision boost, then make sure you go there and sign up to that. Thank you again for listening. We'll be back with some inspector calls after your Unit 1. Have a great Christmas or winter break, and we will see you very soon. Thank you for listening to Litcast, the podcast for GCSE and A-level revision. The music that you hear in this episode is called Galaxy and was written by Ixon, and you can find the rest of his music on SoundCloud. You can also find us on other social media channels, including YouTube, where you'll also find our Litcast live episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you again.